Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are joining us for this very timely, relevant, and no doubt enlightening conversation with Rashad Robinson. Rashad is the president of Color of Change, a leading racial justice organization driven by more than 7.2 million members who are building power for Black communities. Color of Change uses innovative strategies to bring about systematic change in the industries that affect Black people's lives. Under Rashad's leadership, Color of Change designs and implements winning strategies for racial justice, among them, forcing corporations to stop supporting Trump initiatives and white nationalists, framing net neutrality as a civil rights issue, holding local prosecutors accountable to end mass incarceration, police violence, and financial exploitation across the justice system, forcing over 100 corporations to abandon ALEC, the secretive right-wing policy shop, changing representations of race and racism in Hollywood, moving Airbnb, Google, and Facebook to implement anti-racist initiatives, and forcing Bill Riley off of the air. Rashad is widely consulted on strategies for corporate accountability, transforming the criminal justice system, media and tech reform, culture change and narrative infrastructure, and building Black political power. He's a sought-after keynote speaker at events across the United States, so we are very glad to have Rashad give his time to our cause, the Digital Inclusion Challenge, and our audience today. Welcome, Rashad.
Thank you for having me.
Rashad is specifically here to talk to us about building a racial justice framework for equitable education solutions. So without further ado, let's get talking. Rashad, Color of Change is the United States' largest online racial justice organization. Can you give a bit of background on your work and how you build activism in the digital age?
So yeah, it's always helpful to know how we started and why, because it does actually, in some ways, animate how we think about our work and theory of change. So Color of Change was founded a little over 15 years ago now in the aftermath of a flood, which was Hurricane Katrina. And it was caused by bad decision makers and turned into a life-altering disaster by bad decision makers. Black folks were literally on their roofs begging for the government to do something and left to die. And the thing about Katrina, and the thing about so many issues that sort of animate racial inequality, racial injustice, is that people already knew about these problems, right? People already knew about geographic segregation and generational poverty and the impact of what we've done to our planet and the ways in which structural racism undergirds all of those things. But at the heart of it, no one was nervous about disappointing Black people, government, corporations, and media. And when institutions are not nervous about disappointing your community, it's not simply a research report you need that illustrates all the facts and figures or a new documentary. All of those things can be helpful in building awareness, but in moments like that, you need to be able to translate awareness into action. And so Color of Change is a vehicle driven by over 7 million Black folks and allies of every race all around the country that translate awareness, that translate caring, that translate concern into action. Action that has the ability to change the rules. And that means that we have to do that across many different issues, all of the issues that impact Black people's lives, whether it is healthcare or justice, whether it is education or the environment, whether it is all of the ways that we get to live and all of the systems that impact our lives. What does it mean for systems to be concerned about the needs of Black folks and Black communities? And if we can win for Black folks, the history of this country has constantly shown us is when Black people win, we all win. And that, for us, really animates our work and really paints how our founding to now fuels the way in which we engage.
Okay, sounds good. Well, this is really interesting. So thank you. Well, I guess how can these same practices be applied towards ensuring more diversity and inclusion in education access, which has obviously primarily become digital after COVID?
Yeah, and so, first thing is why do we want diversity, right? What does diversity lead and why is it helpful, right? Is it helpful to ensure that we all have access and opportunity? It ensures that the systems that and the infrastructure where diversity exists lends themselves to be more effective, lends itself to providing more opportunity for everyone there, right? And so if we sort of start there, then we have to think about what are the barriers to getting diversity? Who's standing in the way of diversity? What do they want, and why do they want more diversity? Sometimes people have won under a certain system and want to keep that system the same way. Sometimes people have economic or other incentives. Sometimes it's cultural incentives for keeping systems the same way. So now, if we understand the landscape, then we have to create the energy and momentum to force folks to have to do things. Sometimes to invite more people into the effort, but constantly recognizing how we move. It's also important that we focus on how we talk about the problem, right? Because I think a lot of times when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we talk about Black folks or people who are being left out, women, communities of color, in a active voice, and we talk about the systems in a passive voice. And here's what I mean by that. We will say, Black women are less likely to be tenured professors. We will say Black kids are less likely to get admitted into certain types of college programs, right? Instead of these tenure tracks exclude Black women, and these schools have systemically excluded Black people, right? And here's why this is important. On one hand, we will spend a lot of resources and time doing mentorship and pipeline programs, or doing programs that are about like training or literacy to like help people do better inside of systems that also need to reflect on themselves, systems that also need to change over time, systems that have not had inequality at their sort of heart as a mistake, but inequality has been manufactured through the ways these systems have been designed. And so part of moving from a passive voice when we talk about systems to an active voice when we talk about systems also helps us focus on those systems and how we have to fix and change the systems which have excluded people and kept people out. A lot of time we spend trying to fix the people who are not let in the door on how they can get inside of a door that is not closed by mistake, but is closed by design. Let's work to open the doors. And I think what we'll see is more and more people will be able to thrive.
No, that's a fair point about framing the problem differently from what we're used to seeing. So yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I hope this is good information for our audience. This pandemic, it's disproportionately impacting communities across all fronts, including education. How can tech companies work to improve their digital technology and help ensure equitable education outcomes for students?
You know, you talked about diversity right up front. I think it's hard to build tools for communities without those communities involved. And a lot of the challenges in tech is that starts at the very beginning. Starts with who's in the room when these systems are designed. You know, at the height of the early days of us really going inside and having to be, on computers and on the internet and on digital platforms, if we were lucky enough for that to be a way in which we could still do work and keep safe, or still go to be educated and stay safe, if we were lucky enough for that, you know, we were ending up on platforms that had a lot of challenges. You know, Zoom as an example of a platform where Zoom bombing was taking place, where gatherings that were, you know, full of Black people or Jewish folks or women were being bombed, and people were being harassed, and security functions weren't real. And, you know, when we launched our campaign on Zoom, and I had my first meeting with the leadership at Zoom, they said we would never have imagined that people would want to interrupt someone's gathering. And I'm like, of course you would never have imagined that someone would have interrupted people's gathering. If you had a bunch of people around the room building this, that wasn't their experience in life, that wasn't the way in which they had to sort of manage and navigate. If they did not have to find the table in the lunchroom where they felt comfortable, if they did not have to like constantly think about where they belonged and sent messages about where they didn't belong. And so to the extent that these systems will be designed to fail, if in the beginning we design them with folks who do not have all of the information, right? And if we can look at that as a business imperative, not simply charity, right? Not simply like, oh, well, we want to like create space for more voices, but actually more voices need to be at the table so that we build tools and we build vehicles that are actually able to achieve what we want them to.
Interesting. I think there have been quite a few instances since COVID have come up where leaders and of tech companies and major banks have stated something similar to what you said about Zoom because their perspective is so different. They don't have the right people at the table. So completely agree with that. It's just become more prominent these days. It's probably always existed, but it's become more prominent. What does culturally inclusive education look like? And what are some steps schools and universities can take to ensure this happens?
So, I mean, I think, being able to have a system where all of our stories are important, that sort of what we hope that people know about the world allows us to be able to have a world where all of us can be included. I regularly have to deal with very powerful folks in Silicon Valley and corporate America who do not actually have a lot of knowledge around civil rights and get to make decisions about the civil rights of others, right? And so I'm saying this to say about how much our education system has failed people who now have to lead us in moments, have the privilege to lead us, but weren't educated and do not have the tools necessary to be able to solve problems. And so then we end up in systems where these problems manifest themselves. They multiply because we end up with people who don't have the understanding or background. I mean, a lot of our efforts and work and push on Facebook right now is all related to a system and a leadership and a hierarchy of people who may actually be well-meaning at times, but are making decisions void of experience, understanding, and then are doing it in rooms that are not very diverse. And so what that ends up happening is that they consistently make decisions that a couple of months later, a couple of years later, we have to go back on. And so the case I am making for ensuring that the stories of where we've been and how we've gotten here and where we're going are included in our education, that we are uplifting the achievements and the experiences of a range of communities, that we are finding ways to connect that to what people should have to know to be successful in the world. It is a business imperative. And as our country becomes more and more diverse, and as leaders are going to have to know more and more about communities and people than just themselves and just their own, what's in front of them, they're going to be more prepared to do it well, regardless of their background, if they have more information. And so I also just think that's it's going to be incredibly important in a diverse society. We want to make sure that people are prepared.
All right, sounds good. I have, I guess, two questions, but one big last question is, the Black Lives Matter movement has certainly come to global attention throughout the past few months. Is there anything educators can do, not only to educate their students on the movement, but also incorporate a racial and economic justice framework into their curriculum?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that it does go back in some ways to what I said earlier around active voice versus passive voice. How we talk about the systems that are harming and hurting people and what their demands and what our demands actually are, right? How we do that, I think, leads a lot to how we educate people about how to fix these things, how to understand these things. And so, we'll talk about Black communities as vulnerable. And vulnerability is a personal trait. You're vulnerable when you've been vulnerable when you're going through something personally. But Black communities have been targeted, attacked, and exploited. Talking about those issues not through the frames of the weakness of any single community, but actually talking about and showcasing the sort of resilience of those communities. As we talk about stories of voting, right? It's not simply talking about these stories from a framework of Black pain or Black deficit, like how much struggle Black folks have been in, but also talking about the fact that protagonists in the stories are the people who overcome those barriers, that overcome those stories. And so whether we are covering the women's movement or the Black Lives Matter movement, or maybe the intersection of those two, how do we talk about the protagonists in those stories, the heroes in those stories, the people that have overcome. Right now in this era of COVID and era of Black lives, we are seeing a whole lot of Black pain front and center. And a lot of the stories we hear historically are centered on bad things that have happened to Black people, and all of a sudden they sort of went away because some policymaker made them go away. I think it's very important as we tell these full stories and for all of us to truly appreciate one another is that we just don't talk about Black pain, but we talk about Black joy, which is not the absence of pain, but the presence of aspiration, not just what we are fighting against, but what we are fighting for, and all of the ways in which Black culture and Black experience has helped to shape our understanding of this country and how its democracy can work, how we think about food and art and music and so many other things. And that sort of goes for so many other communities as well. Let not just tell a history of fighting and struggling, overcoming, but let's tell a story that is centered on the joy and the aspiration and the hopes and dreams of communities that have constantly worked to make this country live up to its ideals. If we can unlock that, right, then we can tell the fuller story from sort of frameworks of documents with old dudes with wigs to how those stories over time became more real, more consequential, and more relevant as women, as folks of color, as queer folks, as folks at the intersection became part of that story and helped to make that story much more powerful and much more real. I think that is the opportunity in this era, and there's so much resources for that. And so I do want to invite people into telling a new story so we can prepare a new generation to face the problems and to come up with the solutions that are going to hopefully help all of us.
You mentioned stories at the beginning of this, and you're ending with the mention of stories, and I think that's definitely going to inspire some of our students and give some great ideas, so thank you for that. The last one, what advice would you give our participating teams as they embark on this noble challenge of building solutions that enable digital education for all? It's going to be stories, it's going to be grit. What else, as you've gone through this fight for the power of Black people?
The thing that's always important to me and that I have to remind myself as I sometimes go deep on the issues, as I spend a lot of time trying to figure out the problems, as I educate myself and end up maybe knowing more than a person should know about a certain topic, is that you have to constantly listen. Is that ideas are great and they are important, but ideas void of people, void of community, void of the demands of people are not going to win, right? 1,000 scientists for climate change is not as powerful as 100,000 people in motion fighting for climate change. And so the thing I would say to anyone doing any work is that people will unlock the power and potential of any type of policy change, of any type of solutions and platforms. And when people have not been at the center of that, or only some people have been at the center of that, then we get systems, whether they be policies or whether they be platforms, that don't serve all of us. So listening, creating systems for listening, creating systems for feedback, and really digging in to that the people will give us everything we know to unlock the potential for solutions. Knowing that, I think will be incredibly important to winning on anything we work on.
Rashad, thank you so much for your time and truly inspiring insights. On behalf of Convergence, the organizing committee of the Digital Inclusion Challenge, and the participants themselves who will benefit from this conversation as they explore solutions in the realm of digital education. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.